You don't know me, but you don't like me. You don't know
gripping the left lobe with moderate pressure using Pennington forceps. Push the hypodermic needle until exiting the rear epidermis. Insert stainless steel ring into the end of the hollow needle and follow it back through the new opening. Repeat the procedure on the opposing lobe and continue across all skin surfaces with consideration to local anatomical features. Left nostril, center lower lip, left and right eyebrows, bridge, helix, tragus, frenella, and so on. On the morning following the acquisition of several facial piercings, I looked at myself in the mirror. Though acquired in a spirit of great courage and flushed enthusiasm, my new modifications now looked childish to me. I could never take them seriously, so I removed them. Desiring a more permanent medium, I promptly left my apartment and acquired a tattoo on my left arm. But in my excitement, I got a tattoo that was far too large. I felt green and overzealous. And in an effort to balance my mistake, I got another of equal size on my right arm. But now I was too symmetrical. Craving equilibrium, I urgently acquired more tattoos, of all sizes and in a variety of colors and styles. But they were too close together, and I looked as though I had forgotten about my body beyond the skin between my elbows and shoulders. Irritated and dissatisfied, I watched as winter changed to summer, and coats and sweaters were shed as my humiliation grew, as I discovered that my search for balance was common amongst several peers. Across the abundant spring skin, I saw countless tattoos in endless qualities and quantities, bespeckling countless unique individuals around me. I became frustrated by my own preoccupation with what was clearly an ununique problem. Confronted with my own ununiqueness, the urge to respond rose swiftly and with great pressure. Standing before the mirror, I grasped for the extreme, and in a moment of decisive clarity, briskly removed the pinky from my left hand. Ecstatic white silence rang like wedding bells as a torrent of adrenaline and endorphins inside my body and blood outside my body slowly stabilized. Suspended just above the floor for unknowable time, my feet eventually drifted back towards the earth, where I found myself fresh and renewed, finally at peace. Settling back into life on Earth, I decided to celebrate my courageous act by swiftly decoupling the remaining pinky from my opposite hand, and I was again instantly lighter than air. In the following days, I spent up to an hour every morning, standing disrobed and erect in my full-body mirror, proud and in awe of what I had done. I could rejoice at last at my heroic bravery. I had risen above the pedestrian dilemma of tattoos, of epidural in-group versus out-group signification. I could finally relax into my fresh and total corporeal oneness. Then one morning I awoke. I was dreadfully hungover, and stepping before the mirror to gaze again upon my work, as was routine, I could not muster the stamina to stand up straight at attention as usual. Disrobed and straining before my reflection, I collapsed into contrapposto. In ancient Greek sculpture, the development of contrapposto marks the first instance in Western art where the human body is used to express a psychological disposition. An artist's ability to produce in marble the shift in the hips, the majority of one's weight hefted dramatically onto a single foot, marks the dawn of classical Western art, and the ability of the skilled artist to elude complex internal states of their subjects. While a well-rendered contrapposto might suggest the suffering and inner disquiet of a marble figure, it at the same time signified the superior skill of the sculptor, their abilities elevating them above any peer who could not manage to portray poetic gestures in anatomically correct forms. However, here in my bedroom, my collapsing from our archaic rigidity into naturalistic asymmetry rendered me indisputably reduced. Rolling, arching, cascading shapes appeared before me, and my missing pinkies receded beneath a complex anatomy of relaxed limbs and counterbalanced joints. My heroic interventions seemed to me now like mere punctuations, quotation marks at best. And the tattoos which receded beneath my proud missing appendages rode to the foreground like weeds in a garden whose caretaker had grown old and incapable of executing regular maintenance. Even in my compromised state, the mocking hurled back at me by my reflection could not go unaddressed. My lack of energy, mixed with my lack of patience, like bleach and ammonia, and a booming inner violence exploded within me. Acting faster than the speed of consideration, I responded to my pathetic reflection and tore off my left arm. Decide, the Latin roots of which, decadere, means simply to cut off, and shares the same root as homicide and suicide. In other words, to commit a decision is not to describe a choice made, but to murder the unchosen alternative. Only in an apocalyptically hungover state of mind could I have executed a decision as regretful as the one I had just committed. I had gone too far, and life would never be the same. However, if I stopped here, I would wear this decision as a mistake for the rest of my life. I was heavy as lead and burdened with noise, not floating on air or wrapped in warm silence. Though I was of clear mind enough to accept the necessary task before me, and I lopped off my remaining arm. Sensation screamed between my shoulders like an air raid siren. It marched like 100,000 polished boots down my spine. Bandages were in order. I applied miles and miles of bandages. I applied disinfectants and steroid ointments in all shades of white and degrees of opacity. I sank into bed to nurse my wounds, physical and psychological, and I hoped that when I awoke, this would have all been a terrible nightmare, when simply waking would be my salvation from a lifetime of insurmountable shame brought about by reckless indulgence. If this were a dream, the self-inflicted damage incurred would be safely metaphoric, a warning against extremity from my sleeping unconscious to my waking self. Unknowable time passed before I awoke. The initial drama and excitement of my amputations had faded, clearing the room for a glacial remorse I would unfortunately have to grow accustomed to. I collected myself, stood again, and stepped before the mirror. I removed the wraps and gauze by twisting, pulling, and tearing. And there, exposed to my reflection, I could rejoice again. To my soaring delight, my tattoos were finally gone. This one's called a red mist. I know I'm very serious, but this is actually comedy. I hear somebody laughing. I received an invitation to a romantic dinner at an expensive restaurant. Come on, that's a funny opening line. I accepted and prepared by applying soap and warm water, facial cleanser, and a moisturizer, followed by an odorless antiperspirant deodorant. I applied shaving cream, shaved, applied aftershave, and finally I applied an expensive fragrant with light aquatic notes. A crisp, sterile odor, resembling absolutely nothing organic whatsoever. I donned several layers of fine fabrics tailored to my figure: Egyptian cotton, cashmere, linen, mohair, starched, steamed, pressed. I made reservations. I have reservations. I am reserved and apprehensive, so I consumed several alcoholic beverages to make myself personable. I applied good manners, enunciated, and I wore an expensive watch. I ordered not what I wanted, but what was fashionable, and I applied sauce to make it palatable. I had consumed enough, so I lied about using the men's room in order to preemptively settle the bill, and my actions were perceived as polite. An invitation was extended. I accepted, and we proceeded to an unfamiliar apartment with unfamiliar refrigerator contents, cleaning products, odors, and bed sheets of a lower thread count than my own, coarse and strange against my skin. In the following days, I discovered I had acquired a rash, so I arranged an appointment with a general practitioner where I was examined and given a referral to a well-educated specialist. I received a diagnosis, and I was prescribed a bespoke treatment permitting me access to customized creams of muted and dusted hues prepared by a local pharmacist. I brought the creams to my studio, where I applied them to the affected area in thin, transparent layers, alternating between matte and gloss with long dry times between each application. The resulting surface possessed great depth, a constellation of tiny inflamed hair follicles receding into a mist of dermatritic fuchsia, boundaryless and expansive, punctuated by minute lightning strike capillaries pulsating imperceptibly under a single layer of micron-thin skin. I repeated this process for several days. The tailor-made relief they provided seemed to foreshadow the end of this episode until an allergic reaction emerged. My initial rash, direct and uncomplex, had gained an aura and was now ensconced in a luminescent halo of pink. While initially my ailment seemed to me provincial, requiring only practical measures, now a real-time conflict of comorbidity, of nature versus culture, raged across my inguinal epidermis. Upon closer examination by a well-known and respected dermatologist, I learned my condition was indeed dire, and I must act quickly to avoid a more serious infection. The treatment demanded greater ambition. This was no longer a tedious pedestrian interlude, but could likely become the defining work of this year. I applied for project funding, and following a review by an esteemed jury, I was awarded a generous grant by my health insurance company. Now well endowed and institutionally supported, I was prepared to embark on the rigorous journey ahead. I held studio visits, remote visits, and examination rooms with pedigreed doctors from respected institutions, Their insightful feedback helped me to deepen my practice. I gained new peers, artists whose interest in biological and chemical interfaces, whose commitment to the investigation of microbial and viral subversions against the pharmaceutical industrial complex had led us into this new and elite circle. Our discussions were thrilling and sophisticated. It was refreshing to be amongst artists who took their work as seriously as I. Finally, I was gaining the respect I deserved, and it was reflected in my new esteemed peer group. However, my work was proving to be more advanced than what I had prepared for. Yet the challenge affirmed my sustained enthusiasm. After several weeks of heavy drugs and applications of caustic ointments, the applications for additional funding, I watched in amazement as the skin surface upon which I worked bloomed into a soft kaleidoscope of every perceptible color and texture. Calcified craggy peaks and opalescent pools woven together by a vast network of sinuous tapestries. At my next studio visit with the institution's director, we came to the fantastic conclusion that my work was done. My epidermis would be skillfully removed from my studio by the institution's own handlers. Having been an art handler in my youth, I could only bask in the vision of finally being on the other side, the one whose work is handled with gloves, protected by exclusive insurances, and preserved for the examination of the cultured, the educated, and the revered. The care I had taken to reach this point would be overtaken by conservators coordinated by registrars and overseen by couriers. I was told I could expect serious writing to be published in respected journals, perhaps even print, globally distributed magazines, and finally preserved in well-designed catalogs from prestigious publishers. My work would be housed within the rarefied architectures of excellence and placed inside the canon. I was inside the canon and was about to be blasted out into a billion visceral pieces, a red mist, an aura of success and accomplishment. sealed off from intruders for long enough that my memories of guests feels like half-forgotten dreams. I've seen every surface of this place so many times that I no longer see it at all. The contours and textures have leached their way into my unconscious. My inner world has taken on the same qualities. My dreams, reasoning skills, my memory have all taken up residence in an identical imaginary floor plan. And it was here that I was preparing for guests, dinner guests, guests of honor in my home, where I have not hosted guests for several months, years. It has been several years since I've welcomed guests into my home. In a bygone season of my life, I welcomed several guests into my home, countless in fact. At one time, my home was the center of activity for a large and diverse range of guests, a staple of the community, but that was at least a year ago or more. For the return of guests into my home after this long hiatus, I was preparing a fine banquet with an advanced entree, the preparation of which required great skill, practice, and patience. Thankfully, I am very patient, and I've spent my time practicing as I've not been preoccupied with hosting guests for at least a year or more. The dish requires skill and time. Not time as in a watch, but time as in the herb, and a lot of time. I need a lot of time to make this dish. Fresh time, uncompromised time, time that's not been wasted. I was cutting time with a knife that I had taken my time to sharpen, using a ceramic sharpening rod made from patented materials, assembled by artisans. The knife was sharp, and with great economy of movement, it made a decisive hush. As I rhythmically and methodically chopped time into pieces. The rhythm of my chopping made for a wonderful tempo, which I divided into a 3/4 time signature, a waltz. My knife and I were waltzing through time, which I had time to enjoy as my guest would not arrive still for some hours. I was prepping, actually pre-prepping, to ensure there was time enough. The sound and movement of my waltz was unbothered by time restrictions, so I gaily sauntered onward across the wooden dance floor of my large, hard maple cutting board. The Schubert in my mind blended with a far-off Clementi, then Haydn, then Beethoven, feeling ever freer and looser in our dance. A warm intimacy brought my careful blade and I closer. But I wanted to be closer still, so I slipped the cut-resistant safety glove off my left hand. My left hand was now barrier-free to absorb the full texture and sensation of time. I gripped time in my naked hand, where I was met with the cool electric and countless tiny water droplets and the explosive texture of fresh herbs. I could feel every tiny leaf and the dainty wooden bases of their stems, and welcomed the oils and odors my palms and fingers would certainly absorb from our intimate embrace. I held time. I tightened my grip. I was choking time. Each punctuated sensation gave way to a flood of new feeling, melting my imaginary waltz into a dull, ecstatic ambience, riddled with obscure overtones and heavenly resonances. A real feat of psychomusicality, of para-acoustics. My breath became low and heavy, and my well-timed waltz became wet with endorphins, loose around the edges. I felt an all-over feeling of saturation as an invisible layer of sweat rushed to the surface of my skin, and my cheeks went red with heat. Abruptly, my soft ecstasy was shattered like glass by a horrible violence. The music in my head halted by a lightning pain of a sharpened blade. I had sliced clear into my hand, and though I couldn't bring myself to peer down at what was surely carnage, in my mind's eye I saw time, red with blood. The blood still inside my body surged into my head. I became top-heavy, toppled into the refrigerator, and collapsed like soiled linens onto the floor. If I could have heard beyond the noise in my mind, I surely would have heard myself gasping and screaming. Heavy sobs uglied my face. A joyful evening hacked to smithereens on account of a mere millisecond of negligence. I cried at once for my carelessness, and again for the pain pulsating just to the right of my fingernail. With closed eyes, I imagined my injury. It was massive and oppressive, taking command of my life with its forceful jaws and mauling me like captured prey. I tried to come to grips with the horror I had bestowed upon myself and my own body. I opened my eyes. At first I couldn't see it. My vision was too blurry from tears. I blinked and blinked again. I began to turn my hand over and over, and there, after pulling and tugging on the skin around my fingernail, I saw a small fold open like the tiny mouth of a trout, silently screaming for air at the bottom of a dry creek bed. I shrieked and began taking several photographs. I photographed my injury using flash, again using no flash, using various intensities of zoom. I tried black and white, and I adjusted the white balance. However, no matter what combination of settings I used, I became increasingly frustrated that the pain grinding inside of me did not match the images captured. Not only did my injury have the audacity to spite me by refusing to produce a satisfactory gush of blood, my abilities as a photographer were clearly inadequate for producing images of real spirit and violence. I bitterly scrolled through my photographs and was unmoved, lusting for images which might affirm and convey the true severity of my experience. Knife wound hand, sliced fingers, cut off fingertip, fingers crushed in machining accident, severe kitchen knife hand cut, fingers cut need stitches bad. These and several other search engine queries gave me thousands of images which I felt more accurately reflected my affliction. If my wound would not produce blood to tell the horror I had gone through, surely the visual carnage, freely available to me online, would convey it with greater accuracy. Over the next several hours, I collected hundreds of images. Slices, gashes, abrasions, breaks, ruptures, bites, infections, mostly pre-medical intervention. I had no shortage of pictures, and in enough variety that a nuanced and dynamic telling about my injury allow me to recall any combination of exacting imagery. However, the method by which I could do so was in dire need of refinement. What I had amassed was an archive, and every archive needs order. I began tagging and arranging the images using a customized system. Wound type. Select one of 5 categories. Blood amount. Photographic quality. With or without medical dressing or treatment. In a rating scale of 1 to 4, 1 being most likely to recover completely, 4 meaning amputated or amputation necessary. My arrangement began across several folders and subfolders. However, without the satisfaction of the printed physical image, the onslaught of the graphic depictions began to feel dull. I began printing them out on A2 format, on Epson high-gloss paper, but it became immediately apparent that a system of organization which reflected the one developed for storing my digital images, would have to be made in physical form. I began shopping for flat files. I examined my living room and bedroom, considering what furniture could be sacrificed, perhaps even sold, to support my archive. Such meticulous organization requires time. Time. My time still sat half-chopped on the kitchen cutting board, so I called my guests and told them I had too much work before I could entertain. In fact, a complete, comprehensive archive might indeed take months to complete, even years. It could be several years before I am prepared for guests. Thank you.